People ask about the name all the time. They always come up at shows and they're like, "Who shot you?" They want to know that something violent has happened because they think it's an actual question. It's not a question, it's a phrase. It's an old Appalachian term for moonshine. It's one of many names for the illegal brew that's made from out of stills in the mountains during that well, and still now. Popcorn Sutton was one of the most famous of those, and I was watching a documentary one night, and somebody asks him, what are some of the different names? So he starts running through all these, crazy types of terms, and Who Shot John is one that he says.
I started on guitar, and then when I was about 14 or 15, I picked up bass as well. And I played trumpet in school and all that sort of stuff, but guitar and bass have always sort of been my focus. Well, I was about 10 or 11 years old, and for no apparent reason, I just sort of decided to pick up the guitar one day. I mean, my dad played guitar somewhat, and my mom sang a lot, and there'd always been music in the family, and I guess it just sort of came to be time for me to pick it up. So, it was all sort of haphazard, and it's kind of been that way ever since.
When I left home, my daddy said, "Boy, you'll have to learn. Cruel winds will blow, and sometimes your bridges will burn."
My dad is a Methodist minister, and so I was always sort of raised around the church and everything. And he moved to this church in 2006, and this was the old chapel, the old church here that was built in, I believe, 1871. And we had service here when we first came back, and we renovated the space, and we would have maybe, 200 people in this tiny little room. For me, playing in church always sort of provided a context for me to play in. And, of course, being able to be up in front of people on a weekly basis playing music, gives you this time and this space to become a better musician. And so it was always, like I said, it was always sort of a big way for me to get better at what I was doing, and that way when I transferred to being in a band that's playing out and playing gigs and bars and clubs and places like that, I already had this background of performing.
More so than anything else, we want to kind of have a classy image that goes along with kind of the feel in the 20s and the 30s with the illegal bootleg movement of the alcohol and that type of thing, do prohibition and that type of era. We want to kind of have that smooth is kind of what it boils down to, with a little bit of an edge.
With John Douglas through his wife, Lindsay Douglas, who comes to this church. And she just came up to me one Sunday and was like, and I didn't actually know her ahead of time. I knew who she was, but I didn't speak to her. She came up and said, my husband's looking for a bass player. You play bass, maybe you could drop by the house sometime. And I just sort of, lackadaisically agreed. He was like, yeah, sure, whatever, thinking that she'd probably shrug it off or something. And then a few days later, she emailed me with directions to the house and everything. So I was like, I guess I got to hold up to my word. And I went out there, and then of course, John Douglas turned out to be the amazing singer that he is. And so I was like, maybe I'll stick around for this and see what happens.